Hi folks, welcome to CSC325 Database Management Systems, and right now what I want to do is talk about how to connect your Java code that you might be writing to an Oracle database. So I'm going to quickly review some of the things that we talked about last class, but we're going to do it in the context of actually looking at a source code, actual source code, instead of writing it up on the board. So let me just drag this down a little bit so we can look at the source code a little more. So what I have here is a real basic program that I'm calling it's over here, Database Console as a class. It consists of two classes. One's called the Database Manipulator, which does most of the work, and the other is called the main program, which basically calls the database manipulator. So let's take a look at the main program. It's really short and sweet. We create a database manipulator, and then we invoke select, insert, select, update, select, delete, and select. Okay, so basically we do a select against the database, then we look at inserting some tuples into the database. We do a select again to see the tuples were added. We do an update, do a select again to see if the update happened, do a delete, and then finally do a select again. Pretty straightforward. Okay, let's take a look at the database manipulator. So the database manipulator has a couple of critical pieces right at the beginning. I talked about this in last class. There is a string driver name. So this string driver name says that we're going to use the Oracle JDBC driver. The nice thing about encapsulating the driver into a string is that if you wanted to use a different database like MySQL or SQL Server or DB2, you just change the driver name. All right. The second thing is that there's a connection string, the connection URL. I told you I wasn't going to write this out. I don't think I wrote this out on the board. It's pretty long and involved, and it took me a little while to figure out, but I've got it set up. This one's set up for Jen McBride with the password of CSRox55. And the rest of this is the domain name for the cloud-based database server that's running on the Amazon cloud. That's the port number, 1521, where we're going to do the connection. And this CSC325 is the name of the database that we're going to be connecting to. All right. We've got a few getters and setters, but let's take a look again at the code to connect to the database. So I've got a try-catch block. Importantly, I have a system out print line here that says, hey, I'm trying to connect to the database. I'm getting a driver. Then I attempt to get the driver, which may fail if you don't have your project configured correctly. Then I say, hey, trying to connect to the database now. And I invoke a get connection, which sets the member connection. So if this get connection fails, then I wasn't able to connect to the database for some reason. And generally, the stack trace will throw a connection, an exception if you can't connect. Generally, the stack trace will give you some information as to why. So really, two of the biggest pains in the butt in doing any of this database programming, a lot of people spend time, you can spend hours fooling around with this until you get it, is to get that driver name set up correctly and then get the connection string set up correctly. Sort of like a magical incantation. All right, so let's assume that we've connected to the database. Let's take a look at an example doing a select. So I'm just reviewing right now, and then we'll take a look at some stuff that's new. So here's a select example. First thing we do is we create a connection statement. So there's an assumption here that we already have a connection, and that happens in the constructor for the database manipulator class when you do a new. So we do a create statement. And then after the create statement, we execute a query. So here's the query, select star from account. The result of that query goes into result set. So result set's basically the database API collection mechanism. We're expecting a bunch of tuples to come back from the select. It could be 0 to n. And what we do is we have a while loop that executes result.next. Result.next actually loads the next tuple into the result set, and you can start manipulating it. So when we do result set for the first time, if we've got more than 0 tuples, the first tuple will get loaded into the result set. Okay, so once we have the tuple, we can say result.set.get string, or result.set.get something, string. There's a whole bunch of things. In fact, why don't we just take a look at that for a second? So result set dot get. So you can get get a column by, well, okay, this is sort of interesting. So we start out with get array, but there's a whole bunch of different things that you can get. I'll talk about some of them, but there's quite a few, and it's pretty involved. When you get something from the result set, so we're going after the value of an attribute in the result set, the value of a tuple attribute in the result set. So you can do it by column index name. So this is basically kind of indexing it like an array, or you can do it by the name of the column. I told you last class, and I've said it in previous classes, do not do this by column index. The reason behind that is that the attribute order could change without notice, and then your code will break. So if you do it by column label, your code might break if you've removed that attribute from the system, which is fine. But it'll throw an exception, and you'll be able to say, oh, look, my code broke because I'm trying to get this attribute and the attribute doesn't exist. So that's a good thing. If you do it by column index, though, if you have a couple of attributes that have the same type, you're going to be retrieving the wrong values from the tuple, wrong attribute values from the tuple if you alter, if the attributes in the table get altered. So don't do this. All right, so let's look at a couple here. So we can get a large decimal, which is cool. So that you can handle very big numbers because the database can handle very big numbers. This is cool. Get a blob. So the blob is a binary large object. So you could store an image or a music file or a video in a blob. You can get booleans. You can get date. So that's kind of cool. Dates are pretty complicated, and we're going to talk about those later in another class. But it's important that a lot of databases, tables, have an attribute that's date. So get double, get float, you can get an integer, you can get a long. You can get short. There's get short. You can get a string. You can get time. Anything else that's really interesting? I think that's pretty good. There's a lot of other interesting ones that you could investigate. All right, so that's get. That takes care of get. Here what we're doing is we're getting every attribute as a string. Well, we don't have to do that, but that's how we're treating it. So we're getting name, address, ID, and amount. And we're printing it out. Now, the last result set.get string may return null because amount is actually a double in the database. We're doing a get string because the next thing we do is we check to see if it was null. If the result set was not null, then we're going to add amount to the total, and this time we're going to retrieve amount from the database as a double. So that's one mechanism of handling nulls for values, because if we did a get double amount, if we did that up here instead, and amount was null, an exception would get thrown because there's no way to represent nulls in a double, so we have to throw an exception because we can't actually get the double as a null. So this is an alternative to do that, to checking that without actually throwing an exception. Okay, cool. So once we're done with the select, the last thing we do is we do a result set close, indicating we don't care about the collection anymore. And we do a statement close as well. So that frees up database resources, and it's very important to do. If you forget to do this, Java will clean it up, but it may be a while before it actually does the cleanup, and because it's using a garbage collector to do the cleanup. So those database resources will be open until the garbage collector kicks in. So basically, you want to invoke those closes as soon as you're done. Otherwise, you'll use up precious database resources. Okay, let's take a look at an insert example. This is pretty straightforward. In fact, the insert, update, and deletes are all very similar. So we're doing a public insert example. Woo. Got a little comment here, print line that's saying inserting record. I have a try and catch around the database calls themselves. And here I am creating a statement, just like I did in the select. And then instead of doing the execute query, which is what I did up here to do select star from amount, what I'm doing instead is I'm doing an execute update. So the execute update executes this string which says insert into values, Becky Dugan, Wayland, Mass, 32, and 10,000. So this is inserting a tuple into the account database, or into the account table. And then I say statement close. When I do that, I free up the statement resource that was used to do this execute update, and the update happens. Pretty awesome. Okay, the update example is almost exactly like the insert example. So I've got to try, catch, create a statement, then do an execute update, and this time I'm doing an update that sets the amount to the amount times 1.1, where ID equals 42. So the lucky account holder with the ID of 42 is going to get the amount in their account increased by 10%. And then I do a statement close. Now I have a delete example. So the delete example, I'm doing, one thing I want to say about the update is you can see that update account, that account is identifying the table that I'm going after. The set is the change that I want to make to the tuples in account. And then there's a where clause that identifies the tuples that are going to have that change made on it. And the set can be more complicated than just setting amount equal amount times 1. You can set any value to any any attribute to any particular value that you want, and the where clause can be very general. For example, I could just have gotten rid of this where clause, and then everyone would have gotten their amount increased by 10%. Okay. Finally, we have execute delete example. So in the delete, it's sort of like select, but this time I'm going to say from account. So that's where I'm doing the delete. And then I have a where clause that identifies what tuples are going to be deleted from the relation. So in this case, I'm only deleting the tuples with the ID of 32. So I'm going to delete the Becky tuple. And then I do a statement close, and that frees up the resource. There's one last kind of interesting thing that I put in here. It's called a finalize method. So the finalize method is a special method that is called when the garbage collector collects the object. So when the garbage collector collects the object, it will invoke this finalize method. It takes a little digging and research to find out about this. It's pretty cool. The finalize method is a lot like a destructor. So the constructor creates the object, The destructor, or the finalize method, gets called when the garbage collector comes around to delete a database manipulator object. All right? And when that happens, the only thing I want to have happen when the garbage collector comes along is I want to make sure that we disconnect from the database. So the disconnect from the database is pretty straightforward. What you do is you simply say, there's a try-catch block. There's a disconnect from the database. So there's a try-catch block, and we do connection.close. And that frees up the database connection resource. So you want to make sure you do that too, so that you don't have a bunch of database connections hanging open. All right, and finally, I've got my database manipulator constructor, which just simply does a connect to database. And we talked about the connect to database method above. All right, so all that stuff is put together, and like I said, it gets invoked by the main program, and we do a combination of select with some database change, starting out with a select so you can see what the original database looks like. So let's run it. There's one problem with trying to run it, and that is that the project needs to have a link to an external database. Let's see what happens when we run this. I'm a little curious. Oh, that's the wrong program. Let's try this. Run as Java application. Whoops. Get rid of that. Let's do this. Run as Java application. Okay. Okay. So it failed. Now the reason why it failed is because there's a jar file that contains the Oracle JDBC driver that I told you about right at the beginning. Let's go back up there to take a look at that for a second. Okay. So right at the top, I told you that we have to specify a driver name. That driver name encapsulates the specific type of database we're working with into a string. So that's awesome. But we have to have a link to an external library to identify where this driver, basically a jar file with a bunch of classes that lets Oracle database stuff work with Java. We have to find that somewhere. So what you have to do with your project, and this is going to be specific to your machine, is do a right-click on the project, select Properties, and then select Java Build Path. And in the Java Build Path, you have to click Add External Jar. And then what you have to do is find, I'm going to start here. You have to find the jar file. Now for me, the jar file is in SQL Developer, by the way. So when I installed SQL Developer, I'm going to sort this by name. There we go. When I installed SQL Developer, you get the jar file for free. So there's SQL Developer, and then under SQL Developer, there's a library, or there's a folder called JDBC, and under JDBC, oops, there's a folder called Lib, and under Lib, there's the ojdbc.jar. So click Open. And now my program knows about that external jar. So I can click OK. And now if I run it, run as Java application. Okay, it's looking for a main. There's many places where I can have main, but there's my main program. There's several other classes that have main. I'm going to click OK, and we'll run the program. Okay, let's take a look at the output. So it says trying to connect to database, getting driver, trying to connect to database, connecting to database, connection successful. Here's the first select. It gets Bob Dugan, Ben Dugan, and Bell Dugan, and gives me a total. Then we insert a record. So now we have Bob Dugan, Ben Dugan, Bell Dugan, and Becky Dugan, and the totals changed. Then we do now we're updating record. So Bob's getting his salary increased by 10%. Or his amount increased by 10%. So we can see we went from 1464 to 1610. So the update worked. And now we're deleting record. And so we're back to Bob, Ben, and Bell. All right, that is it for the database manipulator, or database console as a class. So this is a very basic Java program that manipulates the database.